The War on Deaf and Disabled People, Capitalism, Welfare and the Making of a Human Catastrophe. Meanings. Capitalism, an economic and political system where trade and industry are in private hands and are run to make profits for the people who own them. Welfare, financial support given to those who are unemployed or otherwise in need. Catastrophe, a disaster. The War on Deaf and Disabled People is a book written by a disabled activist called Ellen Clifford. It came out in June 2020. The book records what happened to deaf and disabled people in Britain from 2010 onwards. It is written from the point of view of deaf and disabled people themselves. Before 2010, the UK was known as a world leader in deafness and disability. The coalition government that came to power in 2010 decided that things had gone too far and that deaf and disabled people were getting too much. They started to take things backwards for deaf and disabled people. In 2008, there was a financial crisis. The coalition government said that there was not enough money to go around because of this crisis. They said that this meant they had to make cuts. These cuts were directed at deaf and disabled people. Deaf and disabled people lost out more than other people. The government hid what they were doing to deaf and disabled people by focusing on benefit fraud. They said what they were doing was about stopping fraud. Newspapers and TV gave a lot of coverage to stories of benefit fraud. This gave the public the idea that benefit fraud was a much bigger problem than it really was. What the government did is one half of the story of what happened since 2010. The other half of the story is about how deaf and disabled people fought back. There was less campaigning by deaf and disabled people from the mid-1990s onwards. After 2010, it started back up again. Deaf and disabled campaigners were at the forefront of the wider fight against the cuts. This helped to raise awareness of deafness and disability issues among non-disabled campaigners. It is an important thing to have done. The new campaigning was slightly different. Before 2010, campaigning by deaf and disabled people focused more specifically on deafness and disability issues. After 2010, deaf and disabled campaigners made stronger links with other groups. And joined in with campaigns on issues affecting everyone. At the same time, things are still getting worse for deaf and disabled people. In spite of all the campaigning we have done, there is still so much to fight for. This book is a chance to look back over what we have done and to learn lessons that can help us plan the best way to go forwards. What has happened to deaf and disabled people should be of interest to non-disabled people as well. It is not possible to properly understand what has happened to people since 2010 without understanding economics and politics. The way deaf and disabled people are treated in capitalist society shows how cruel capitalism is. It is a very good way of showing what is wrong with the system we live under. The book follows the social model of deafness and disability. This is a way of understanding deafness and disability that sees that there is nothing wrong with deaf and disabled people. Society is the problem because it leaves deaf and disabled people out and looks down on us. Another way the government got away with making war on deaf and disabled people was by making so many different cuts all at once. This meant there was too much for campaigners to keep up with. Some cuts were stopped. Campaigners use lots of different ways of fighting back, including research, speaking up to politicians, taking the government to court and holding protests. So much happened, it is impossible to record it all in one place. It is also not possible to name all the deaf and disabled campaigners who have been fighting back since 2010. This is because people who claim benefits are constantly watched. If a deaf and disabled person is seen to be active in any way, their benefits can get taken off them. Part 1 of the book looks at the history of deafness and disability. Deaf and disabled people are the world's largest minority, and yet our lives are largely unseen or understood by wider society. Deafness and disability is seen as a reasonable excuse to exclude people. And it is still acceptable to discredit a person by comparing them to a deaf or disabled person. For example, words such as moron and lunacy are commonly used in politics to attack an opponent. The book argues that negative attitudes towards deaf and disabled people are the result of how society is organised in a way that puts profit before people. Deaf and disabled people who cannot produce profit are separated off and devalued to justify spending as little on their support as possible. Many people just accept that this is the way things are and do not question it. Conditions improved over the last century as a result of deaf and disabled people and their allies fighting back. However, by the mid-1990s, the disabled people's movement had gone into decline. When the Tories came into power with the coalition government in 2010, deaf and disabled people had to rebuild their networks and get active again before they could resist the attacks. Part 2 gives an overview of the different laws and policies brought in by the government since 2010. It is through these laws and policies that deaf and disabled people's living conditions have gone backwards. At the same time as taking things from deaf and disabled people, the government did other things that benefited the richest people in society. Cuts were made to benefits and also to independent living support. Independent living does not mean doing everything for yourself. It is about deaf and disabled people having the same chances as non-disabled people. To live in the community and to have choice and control over their own lives. Part 3 looks at how the cuts have hurt deaf and disabled people. The chair of the United Nations Disability Committee said that the cuts in Britain had caused a human catastrophe. Deaf and disabled people have been left without money or food through benefit cuts. Some have died or taken their own lives as a result. On a wider level, deaf and disabled people have become more excluded from the rest of society. The book argues that brutal cuts hitting deaf and disabled people have played a key role in political changes taking place since 2010. But that the importance of this role has often been overlooked. This is because so many people in positions of power have no idea about deafness and disability. As a result, they have been making wrong guesses about how things were going to turn out politically over recent years. Smaller parties such as the Scottish National Party, saw a value in seriously engaging with deafness and disability issues. The SNP benefited from this approach with their landslide victory at the 2015 general election. There was wide support for Jeremy Corbyn as leader of the Labour Party. As a result of the steady support shown to deaf and disabled campaigners by himself and John McDonnell. Part 4 looks at why cuts have been targeted at deaf and disabled people. There is nothing new about this approach. Similar welfare laws and policies were passed in Britain during the Great Depression in the 1930s and on other countries such as Germany and the United States during the 1990s. The Tory government's agenda has been driven by the aim of giving more profit-making opportunities to businesses. This has been done through privatisation, where contracts to run public services such as carrying out benefit assessments and providing social care support have been given to private businesses. Changes to welfare have made life as difficult and distressing as possible for people who get benefits. People in paid work will put up with worse paying conditions. The more frightened they are of what will happen to them if they lose their jobs. This is another way that welfare policies have helped business. The book also picks up on the scale of mistakes made by the Department for Work and Pensions over recent years. It argues that the government should not be let off the hook for errors that cause harm to thousands of people. Funding for welfare changes has been well short of ambitions to completely reinvent the whole security system. Benefit claimants have been placed in positions of high risk. Numbers have died as a result. This is evidence of how little concern the DWP has for their lives. Deaf and disabled campaigners consider that the national charities have helped the government harm deaf and disabled people by doing too little to oppose them. The public has a lot of trust in deafness and disability charities without understanding the interests they serve. Larger charities look for where they have shared goals with politicians and focus their energies on these areas. They want to keep their place at the table with government. Government is then able to use their continued engagement as proof that they cannot be doing anything too bad to deaf and disabled people. In other words, the charities let themselves be used as cover for the cuts. Part 5 looks at the resistance put up by deaf and disabled people against the government attacks. More than 1 in 5 of the population is deaf and or disabled. Measures that hurt deaf and disabled people affect a lot of people. Deafness and disability issues can cause problems for government. The book argues that deaf and disabled people have a key role to play in the fight back. The book assesses the new deaf and disabled people's activism that emerged from 2010 onwards and how far it differs from earlier periods of struggle. Differences include use of social media, greater inclusivity of different groups of disabled people, and stronger links with trade unions and non-disabled campaigners. Similarities include use of direct action tactics and the importance of art and protest. Campaigning wins that have been achieved are a product of coordinated collective action. Campaigning since 2010 has brought more awareness of deafness and disability than ever before. At the same time, the living standards of deaf and disabled people have gone backwards. The book ends with looking at how we can go forwards. It argues that we need to fight for things to be better here and now. But we also need to look at the bigger picture. This includes understanding that bad treatment of deaf and disabled people will always be present in society while we live under capitalism. It also calls for deaf and disabled people to work together. To refresh the social model of deafness and disability, and to use it as a tool for collective action